What is up? It is December 26th, 2024, and it is about 20 after 7 at night. So I'm not commuting right now, of course. Um, but because this week is a little bit weird with holidays, Christmas, all that fun stuff. Boxing Day, if you're in Canada, which I'm not anymore. Kind of weird. No Boxing Day here. It means I'm driving a little bit less, and then I went to the gym with my wife today, so I didn't film because I don't think she wants me making vlogs while we're driving together. So I figured I would jump in and try to get one answered from the comments before I go into tomorrow. I think tomorrow I'm going to the gym, so I should be able to get two done tomorrow, which is kind of cool. Like being able to do that, but I'm not going to the office. So this week I've gone to the office just Monday. So pretty limited, but we'll try to get it done still. So the topic for today is from Web Developer Ninja 9220. It says, appreciate your talks. What are your thoughts on dedicated QA versus dev teams testing themselves? Do I need to hire a QA team for my dev team? Thanks, bro. Um, and I think this is a really cool question. The answer is it depends. There we go. Done. No, so I'll talk through some different perspectives on this from my own experience. That way you can see the bias that I have in either direction on this. But I'll try to see if I can navigate and I don't know. Like I like being able to share different perspectives, even if they're not necessarily something that aligns with my own experience. So we'll go through that together. Friendly reminder that if you want stuff answered, leave a comment below, please, or look for Dev Leader on social media. That's my main YouTube channel and the handle I use across all platforms. So send me a message, leave as much detail as you want, and I'll keep it anonymous. And that way you can provide more detail so I can answer more effectively because I like this question, for example, but it's generic, right? So if this person, web developer ninja 9220, had like a very specific situation, then I could try to tailor my answer to it. So nothing wrong when it's generic in general. That's totally fine. But my answers are generally going to be more generic. And a quick reminder too, I've been trying to do more sort of promoting of the other channel. So on Dev Leader on Mondays at 7 p.m. Pacific, I do live streams, and it's actually filmed right here. So if you like my code commute videos, but you want the chance to engage and basically ask questions in the chat, definitely try to join at 7 p.m. Pacific. Just go to Dev Leader. That's my main YouTube channel. And I generally have a topic that's from my newsletter. Again, I keep letting people know, like, if you're like, oh man, newsletters are dumb, I don't like that. Don't worry. I'm not trying to, trick you into subscribing to it or whatever. But like, if you want to know the topic that I'll be going through on my live stream, then you can go to weekly.devleader.ca. You don't have to even sign up for the newsletter. So if you just want to read through what the topic's going to be and have it with you, that goes out on Saturdays. You have all Saturday, Sunday, and Monday to check it out before the live stream. But if there's questions and stuff in the chat, it's an AMA style, so I'll spend my entire time answering questions if there's enough questions to answer. So with that said, my thoughts on dedicated QA versus devs testing themselves. Okay, so I have lived through all sorts of variations of this, and I will talk through different situations that worked well or didn't work well, just so you can kind of see, like I said, you can understand my biases so that when I try to form opinions about this, you understand why and where I'm coming from. So super high level, like just to kind of put it out there, my preference is that to not have dedicated QA teams. And this is for building end user software, for building platform software. I am not a fan of having dedicated QA teams. And now I will try to explain why, and then I will also try to highlight situations where that may not be the case. But from my experience, I do not prefer to have dedicated QA teams separate from developers. So let's get into that. So when I used to work at Magnet Forensics before Microsoft, in the earlier days, we would hire developers and testers. And what would generally happen, well, in the very beginning, what used to happen, and this isn't good. So if you are listening to what I'm about to say and you're like, well, that's a bad way to do it, you're right. At least in our circumstances, it was not good. And maybe people have seen success with this, but we certainly had to move away from it. But how this used to work is that we would have testers, and the testers had a testing team. And what would happen is that the developers would basically write code, make features, or fix bugs. And then when they were done, they would say, "Great, testing team, here you go. I'm going to go move on to the next thing." And the interaction was very much like that. So the idea is that like developers get to focus on making things and testers get to focus on, we would hope, like not finding bugs, but it's their job to find bugs. And that's what they're going to do. So what would happen is you would base as a developer, you'd go get your thing done, whether it was a bug fix or a feature. You'd kind of toss it over the metaphorical wall to QA, and like basically immediately they would go, "Well, this doesn't work," or some variation of that, right? Because sometimes, and many times, it was like this feature is just literally broken, or this bug is still not fixed, just like outright. This would happen a lot. Or you would get into circumstances where someone's like, "Okay, like it kind of works, but like what about this scenario? What about that scenario?" And then you'd have this like conversation where it was like, "Okay, like how much of that should we be fixing?" And like these are good conversations, right? Like it's not just anything that they said like has to go get fixed. Like we'd have to go have a conversation to say like, I mean, maybe that was expected behavior. Interesting, right? So maybe the things that QA folks are finding, like we have a conversation about it, and it's like actually like no, like this actually does make sense that it's this way. This actually isn't broken. Maybe there's a misunderstanding. Maybe we should change the flow of this so that the behavior that we're having is actually more intuitive. Like it's not just sort of like a binary black and white kind of like thing to go do. So those conversations were good, but the inefficiencies that it would introduce were ridiculous because you would context switch, right? You're finished as a developer. You would context switch, toss it over the wall, go work on your next thing. So you've switched over. You like just getting into it, and then like you get contacted by QA. So you're like basically disrupted like a lot. And then it was like, okay, well, we at one point we were like staggered sprints. So the developers and the testers would kind of work off sprint from each other and offset by a week. They were 2 week sprints. And that way, how it would work is that testers would pick stuff up, and you would already, as a developer, you'd already be kind of like through a bunch of stuff before they start picking things up. And this was even worse because what would happen is that they would pick things up at the beginning of their sprint, and you've already moved on from it because maybe you finish at the beginning of your sprint. And then they would be like, "Hey, this doesn't work." So now, by the time, like, what do you do? Do you go fix it right now, mid sprint, and change your sprint commitments because your shit's busted? Or do you go, "Okay, well, let's bring that back to to us for as the developers, and we'll address it in the next sprint." Now you have this like a 2 week period. So you've spent time building stuff that took X amount of time. Then you have this 2 week period where it's sitting broken. It's not actually good. And to make it worse, it's already in the product. It's like not on a feature branch. So it's in the product. It's broken according to QA. And now 2 weeks after that, you're getting it back to go fix it, to go repeat the cycle again. So as I say this, you're probably like, "That sounds really stupid. How could you ever do that?" And like, that doesn't mean that having a dedicated QA team is bad. And I'm not saying that. I'm just saying like this is like a thing that we did when we were growing. And it was for good reason. We were trying to optimize things, and then we would try it out, and we were like, in practice this is not working in our favor. So over a long period of time, like there were always testers at Magnet. Pardon me. Still like got like residual cough, which is pain in the ass. I feel like way better, but just this residual cough from that cold. So we always had testers at Magnet. To this day, I don't. I'm assuming they still have testers. And I'm not here to say like, oh, and like that's a bad thing, because if it works, it works, right? I'm not here to tell you like don't do this or always do that. That's not my intention. I'm just sharing my experience. Um, we had as Magnet was growing, we had teams that would sort of gravitate towards different things, but most of the time there was dedicated testers on a team. And that's already a change because I said dedicated testers on a team, not a dedicated team of testers. So one sort of positive sort of learning that I would take with me throughout all, like, and I will, until I have disproven this to myself at some point in the future, this will be sort of like we call it like a tenet of like how I would put together software teams, is that if you have roles that you think are important for a team, don't put them on islands. Don't separate them. You make a team an autonomous unit. So that would mean if I had a team of developers and I did want other roles, like I wanted testers, I would put the testers into the team. I would put the product owner or product manager or project manager or whatever combination into the team. If we had, so at Magnet at one point we had like technical, and I'm sure they still do, like technical writers. We had people that would write documentation. At one point it was one person and they operated on an island. And to no fault of their own, like, because that's just how it was structured, they were a huge bottleneck. Not because they sucked or they were bad or something like that, but they were a huge bottleneck because if they're an important part of what has to get done and there's X number of teams waiting for them, they have, like, they're set up with a different set of priorities. Now we have all this overhead of coordinating priorities. It just doesn't make sense in practice from what I've seen. So I would very much recommend putting roles within teams so that the team can operate autonomously. As soon as you're creating more and more dependencies between teams, which you're already going to have when you're building software and you're contributing to the same like suite of products and services, you're already going to have this like this overhead of working together. But I would try to minimize that by putting roles together in teams. So what I would not do personally, if I had my own way, I would not put product managers on the product manager team. I would not put project managers on the project manager team and testers on the testing team, developers on the development team. I would make teams, and if I had those roles, I would embed them as necessary within. Now, there may be situations where, depending on the size of the team or like the life cycle of where a product or service is at, um, or I don't know. There's a lot of other factors, but something like perhaps I might have a product manager that's able to work across two teams. But again, they're not on an island and everyone else is sort of using them, but I might span them across a couple teams. The same thing could be said about like the documentation person, for example. Or this other role, which I want to talk to you about regarding testing. So before I get there, though, I wanted to say that in this evolution, we started to take on some of this structure, and we were putting testers on teams. Now we still had documentation entirely outside of it. Product managers, I mean, project managers came later, but product managers were like at some point they were like kind of in the teams, and other points they like became an island. So kind of went different directions. But testers were on the teams. Now many teams stuck with this. And I think like they found that it worked well for them. And I want to, as I move forward, I'll kind of talk about where I saw challenges, or I'll call them inefficiencies. And I want to be careful how I say this because as I say it, my intention is not to say because the testers were bad or because testing is useless. I don't want people to misinterpret what I say, so I just want to be careful about how I say it. So it's none of what I just said. It's like I think testing is valuable. I think that there is a sort of a role or a time and place that makes sense for this stuff. So I think there were some teams that had embedded testers on the team, and that worked well for them from their perspective. And on the teams that I manage, we moved away mostly from that. And I'll it's a bit of okay. I'll wait till that one till the very end. But what we started to do was a lot more of empowering developers to test. And again, that's not because we were saying, oh, testing's useless or the testers are dumb or they don't have it, like they don't have the skills or we're better. Nothing like that. We were trying to look at the effectiveness of what the testing was that was getting done and the type of work we were doing. And we said, look, like we have all these regressions and it doesn't make sense for a human to go click through and try to verify everything. So my teams tried to structure code in a way that was more isolated so that we could make changes in one spot, not affect everywhere else. That was one thing from like an architecture and software perspective, like software design perspective. But the other thing is, and this is almost a forcing function, we didn't have like when we were spinning up some of the teams I had, we didn't have like people to go staff them very easily. So we brought in a tester, and he's actually I have a we haven't done it in a while, but I have another podcast called "Dude, Where's My Code?" and my co-host Graham Harvey is great friend of mine, friend for life, and we've worked together on teams and stuff. He's now I don't know if he's got his VP title, but he's a director, at least a director of engineering at a startup now. So he's doing great. He's managing teams and stuff, but he was our tester. And we consciously said, and like not like we told Graham we had to do it this way. I feel like this was a lot of Graham coming through. And it wasn't like, hey, Graham, we're just going to do what all the other teams are doing or what we've always done. We're going to make the stuff. We're going to toss it over the wall. Now it's your problem. Instead, we worked as a unit. So we would, as developers, work with Graham, and he was our test strategist. Now, we made sure across everyone in the team and the things we were building, there's another nuance to this that I need to introduce. When we talk about product owners are like our user proxy. Okay. So I think that testers need to take on this user proxy a lot. So they need to act on behalf of the user because I think that it's not sufficient to just say, like, I'm a tester, I'm going to click buttons until things break. Like, yes, that is helpful for catching things, but like, say that's all you did and you weren't thinking about the usability of things. And I understand that I'm oversimplifying the role of a tester. Just to make a point. If they're not taking on the user like as a by proxy, then they're missing out on tons of it. So like there's a lot to be said about QA, right? It's like literally the quality of what we're producing, not just is there a bug, but is this thing usable? Is it valuable? And we were confident that we could try to optimize this process. So not only did we have like our product manager that was our user proxy, but at Magnet, I think this is a really brilliant idea. They actually hired on forensic examiners and investigators into different roles within the company. Like I said, I think it's a genius move. So they would have some salespeople that worked in digital forensics, right? They had trainers that worked in digital forensics. They had people that worked sort of like in the product space and with the engineering teams that worked in digital forensics. And it was super cool because it meant that we had literal users that were working with us. So yes, they were a proxy for the user, but like they actually were users. So we would have our product owner, so our product manager who acted as the product owner. We would also bring in sort of like one of the investigators or examiners that worked for us. And they weren't doing investigations. They had different roles when they worked for us, but they could act as the user proxy. We could say, hey, if you were doing an examination or doing an investigation, like how would like walk us through, like, is this usable? Like kind of take us through this stuff. So we had access to these people. And it was tremendous. So this really helped as well with the test strategy, which is what, so when I mentioned Graham, he was our test strategist. So we could get on the same page as a team, right? And you might not need every developer on the team. I'm talking about like as we're taking on a feature or something like that. We'd all get on the same page for it. And then it was like, cool, like now we know from a user's perspective what we want to go build. I will go work with the test strategist to talk about, as I want to go build this stuff out, what things am I building? Like, where am I touching? And what tests am I going to write that are automated? So what was really cool about this, and like, because I love writing coded tests and making sure that I have not just like test coverage, but like confidence built up in what I'm coding, I could go have a conversation with someone like Graham and say, hey, look, here's the stuff we talked about in terms of usability, and I'm going to walk you through the different tests that I wrote that try to cover some of this stuff. And how this would work is like Graham was technical enough. He wasn't writing code like at work with us, but he was technical enough that I could walk him through like a test setup and say, here's where I'm setting up these things. And I could walk him through. And he's not going to know every single class and everything else in the code, But he would say, like, have you thought about a scenario like when that service isn't working, or when we were doing mobile forensics, like what happens if that's not supported, or the phone disconnects, like these things where he's thinking through, and it's like, oh, you're right, like I don't have an edge case like that. So not only was he really helpful for going through stuff like that with us, but also kind of looking at the tools that we had for testing and being able to say, like, we don't have automation that like, or like a framework that would support this kind of thing. So we're starting to notice like a gap, like maybe we should pause and like go invest into some of this stuff so we could go have better test coverage. Then we're not like avoiding these types of tests because we can't build them. We actually have something for it. So the role of the test strategist became much less about actually testing things and helping us as a team make sure that we could go forward and have a strategy around testing. Um, One of the things that like that was really cool in terms of how we evolved was like we would continue down this path, right? And it's always a continuous improvement. So we'd get to the point where like we'd, you know, we'd show Graham the new tests and stuff we added. Graham would go try it out. So there was some exploratory testing. So usually what would happen is like we'd get it kind of working and let him try it, right? So that he could say, like, this feels like what we talked about. It wasn't so much like, oh, let me try every edge case, but like, let me just get my hands into it and see if this is actually kind of flowing like what we described, or did we maybe have a misalignment? So we would get him something early that he could at least try to poke around in, and that would give him some ideas too about edge cases for writing more tests, like coded tests. So we'd work in this pattern, and something that was really cool was that by the time, like, we just became very efficient at doing this, and a lot of the times we'd hand it over to him, and it kind of felt like he was doing like a sanity check in the UI and clicking through stuff, and he would still catch some bugs that way. And we got to the point where we're like, hey, Graham, like, we think that we can actually write coded tests for some of the UI things that you're seeing. And what was awesome about that was that we started to change how we were designing. It was a desktop based application. So we changed some of the way that we were writing code. And that way we could show him a test that would say, hey, look, this test actually says when we go do X, like, this is how the UI is going to change. We can actually check the sizes of things. So you don't have to go resizing things and look for weird edge cases or visibility or things being disabled. Like, we can show you this stuff actually working. So again, it like changed how we started to write code so that we could prove in tests. And I think that worked really well. Now, that team, like, we worked together for a while, and I don't want to say that like we didn't need Graham. Like, I think that it helped tremendously. But what we did was we essentially were able to, instead of having multiple testers on a team, we had one person that was a test strategist, that we became so effective testing our own stuff, writing the tests by like talking with them, communicating with them. We didn't need like traditional testers on the team going through stuff. So again, it's not to say that the activity of testing or QA is not valuable. It's just that we accomplish it in different ways. Very connected with our product owner, very connected with examiners or investigators, because they were literally in-house with us. And then we worked on strategy. And it forced us as developers writing the code to make sure that we were always writing coded tests for things. And I've kind of stuck with that being my mental model as something that worked extremely well. I understand that not everyone's going to have the luxury of having like, you know, your end user in-house, so to speak. But that model of like, let's get the developers to actually think about what needs to be tested and make that part of the culture of development, that was transformative for us. Now, there was a time after that later on where I took on, sort of like, stood up another team, and there was someone that we added to the team that was not quite like a test strategist role, and their role on the team, again, it was like out-ratioed compared to other teams. We had one tester and we had multiple developers again. And it was kind of this forcing function of like, hey, look, it's not going to be sustainable for you as the single tester to be like sort of the bottleneck to go find and be responsible for all these things. And that's on purpose. Like, we want to make sure, like, in the beginning, it's probably going to be a little bit rough, right? Things are probably going to feel a little bit slow because you are going to be the bottleneck. But we're not here to like stress you out or to like make this terrible for you. What we want to do is make it a forcing function. So in this team, it was unique because a lot of the work we were doing was I've talked about this before, very repeatable in terms of the structure of work. So there were going to be edge cases all the time, but like the bulk of what we were doing was extremely repeatable. So we said, like, because it's repeatable, we should be able to codify a lot of what's being tackled. So in the beginning, it's going to be rough. We want you to teach us. Teach us as the developers, what types of things are you looking for? We will start adding those things in. We'll make them part of what we're building. We will codify what you are trying to do. And it worked. We would start to, like in the beginning, yes, it was slow. And then we'd say, okay, for the next one, I'm going to add this type of test. Oh, we don't have this type of infrastructure. Let's set it up. And then we would do it. And then we would find like some edge case and we're like, okay, like this is proving why having someone else, like second set of eyes looking is valuable. Great. And then, oh, like there's this other emerging pattern of things that we're looking for and it's catching bugs. Like, great. Okay, developers, like let's make this part of like how we're testing our code and writing tests. And that worked really well too. So again, it was about changing that role of the QA to not be, you're not operating on an island. So back to this person's original question, like dedicated QA or like QA teams, like I don't like the idea of it. I just don't. I don't like having islands of people. It feels, from my experience, it feels extremely inefficient. To touch on the other side of it, I think some of the benefits you get are that you have like-minded people that are thinking about these types of things that can work together. But I would accomplish that in a different way. And there's different, and I'm going to forget the companies and stuff or the different names for this type of stuff, but I've heard it called like guilds. At Magnet, I think we borrowed the term from somewhere else, but we had like a guild concept. So there was like a testing guild. So we had different teams that had testers on them, and there was a testing guild that would meet periodically and they would talk about testing topics. So, hey, like what framework should we start looking at? What styles of testing should we be trying out more? So they would meet and it was like cross-functional and cross-team. I guess it wasn't cross-functional. It was like a pure function meeting cross-team. We had like an architecture guild where people would talk about software architecture. So we would set these things up so that people could meet with people that were like-minded, focused in these areas to talk about ways forward. But the whole point is that I have found a lot of success in embedding. If you're going to take testers or QA, I would embed them in the team personally. That's my go-to. And ultimately, I think the most effective thing is that you don't separate that as a different role in terms of like someone like a QA or a tester being responsible for the quality or the gatekeeper of it. I think that needs to come from the team. I think it needs to be built into the culture. You need to be having conversations with your product owner. If you don't have access to like a user proxy in-house, right? Even if your product owner is like, they're not a great representation of the user, unfortunately, because they're not experienced or something, being able to do things like beta testing, surveys with users, even like outside of work now when I'm building brand ghosts, like we have telemetry and analytics built into everything. So we do try to talk with our users, but we can also measure how users are using the product. And if we're like, that's weird, like we designed it so that users would kind of flow through this way, and we're like, they're not doing that. Either they're not doing it and getting a result, or they're getting the result, but they're going around something. Like, okay, we're using data. So that's more about user experience, right? But we have telemetry for errors and exceptions and stuff too. So we're able to leverage that. On the one team where I mentioned Graham already, when we had him as a test strategist there, we built in a ton of analytics for error reporting. And I've talked about this team before, but I was so proud of the team because we had an awesome tech support guy. He's just such a good hire early on. He's just like an absolute legend of a tech support person. I could never do that role. So kudos to him. He was always so calm, and I don't understand how, like impossibly calm. And he knew what I was like too, because I'm a little bit high strung. There's stuff that I absolutely would not say to clients. Like I would get frustrated, and it's like safe place, right? So but then we'd be talking, and I'm like, okay, I know he's got to go back and he's got to walk through this, walk the user through something, sorry. And so I'm like, okay, let me get my thinking cap on, like, let's talk through this. um but yeah, like, on that team, we were able to get error information faster than tech support would get the calls in for it. So he would come talk to us about stuff, and we'd say, we already have a fix for it, which is super cool. So again, it's not like, if we had better testing, yeah, maybe we wouldn't have the escapes, but we were changing how we were developing software, and it allowed us to move incredibly fast. We had a handful of people that were building a product that was competing with a company that had a monopoly over the entire mobile forensic space. And we were doing a good job. So it worked. And it worked very well. So for us, we moved, and just kind of to summarize, we moved away from having dedicated testing teams early on in Magnet, and then the teams that I managed moved mostly away from having dedicated tester roles in the team, to move more towards how do we address testing strategy, just like how you might with software architecture. It's like testing architecture, and then analytics, telemetry, and then really engage with your user proxies. So either users or product owners. So that's my recommendations for this kind of stuff. So Web Developer Ninja 9220, I hope that helps. I think there's many ways to do this, but as I said, that's what I found to be most effective in my journey. And in the future, if I am putting teams together, that's exactly how I will approach it until I see other data or try something else out. If that happens to work better, I am happy to adjust. So everything I've just said is sort of the culmination of experiments, trial and error, and that's where I left off with those things. So hope that helps. Thanks so much for watching. And remember, Dev Leader YouTube channel, Mondays at 7 p.m. Pacific for the live stream. I'll see you there. Take care.